January 1944. A pale winter sun hangs low over the pine forests of rural America. Frost clings to the barbed wire fencing of a prisoner of war camp somewhere in the southern United States. Guard towers stand silent, their silhouettes sharp against the cold sky. Inside one of the wooden barracks, the air smells of chalk dust and damp wool. Rows of men sit at simple desks. They wear field gray uniforms stripped of insignia. Some are middle-aged. Some are young. Most are officers of the former German army. Their posture is rigid, disciplined by years of command. Yet in their hands, instead of maps or weapons, are notebooks. At the front of the room stands a chalkboard. Written in English are words few of these men ever expected to see in captivity: political theory, American history, engineering fundamentals. A bell rings, not for roll call, not for rations, but for class. An American civilian instructor begins to speak. No guard interrupts him. No ideology is enforced at gunpoint. The prisoners listen in silence, exchanging glances that betrayed disbelief more than gratitude. They had prepared themselves for hunger, humiliation, and revenge. They had not prepared for a college lecture. And in that quiet classroom, behind wire meant to break men, a deeper question begins to form, one that will unsettle these officers long after the war itself ends. Why would a nation at war educate its enemies? The answer lies far beyond this room, in the way this conflict was being fought, not just on battlefields, but in minds. By the time German officers were sitting in American classrooms, the war had already crossed a point of no return. January 1944 was not a moment of uncertainty for the United States. It was a moment of momentum. American factories were operating at full capacity, producing aircraft, tanks, rifles, and ammunition in numbers that no Axis power could match. The U.S. Navy dominated the Atlantic shipping lanes. The U.S. Army Air Forces were striking deep into German industrial centers. And on the Eastern Front, the German army was bleeding itself dry against the relentless pressure of the Red Army. The global balance had shifted for Germany. The war had become a struggle of survival. For the United States, it had become a question of how the war would end and what would come after. As Allied forces pushed through North Africa, Sicily, and the Italian mainland, German units surrendered in growing numbers. The defeats at Stalingrad in early 1943 and Kursk in the summer shattered the myth of German invincibility. Entire formations were captured, not in dozens, but in tens of thousands. Many of these prisoners were no longer raw recruits. They were experienced officers, men who had commanded battalions, companies, and regiments. By mid-1943, the Allies faced a logistical reality that few had anticipated at the war's outset. What to do with hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war? Britain, battered by years of bombing and stretched thin by manpower shortages, could not hold them all. The Soviet Union had neither the capacity nor the inclination to treat prisoners in accordance with international norms. That burden fell increasingly on the United States, a nation geographically untouched by invasion, economically intact, and legally bound by its own interpretation of the Geneva Convention of 1929. The convention was clear on paper. Prisoners were to be housed, fed, and protected from violence. Officers were not required to perform manual labor. They were to be allowed intellectual pursuits. Yet no clause explicitly required education on this scale, or at this depth. What followed was not simply compliance with international law. It was an expansion of it. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States would hold more than 425,000 German prisoners of war in over 500 camps across the country. They were scattered from Texas to Arizona, from the Midwest to New England. These camps were often placed near agricultural centers where enlisted prisoners could be used as laborers. Officers, however, were separated and housed under different conditions. It was among these officer camps that something unprecedented began to take shape. American military planners understood that officers were not just soldiers, they were carriers of ideology, discipline, and institutional memory. They had been shaped by years of Nazi education, propaganda, and command culture. Many were loyal to Hitler. Others were already disillusioned, though cautious in expressing it. Inside the camps, the U.S. Army faced a dilemma. Idle officers bred unrest. Boredom led to radicalization, secret courts, and violence against anti-Nazi prisoners. German military hierarchy continued to operate behind barbed wire, enforcing loyalty through intimidation and covert punishment. Simply locking these men away was not enough. The American response was shaped by confidence rather than fear. The United States had not been bombed into desperation. Its cities stood intact. Its universities functioned normally. Its democracy, though imperfect, had survived the strain of total war. That confidence would soon be tested not by enemy weapons, but by an idea that would shock the prisoners themselves, the belief that education, not coercion, could neutralize an enemy officer corps. And it began quietly, without ceremony. Inside camps that had been designed only to hold men, not to change them, that quiet beginning would soon become a formal policy, one that many German officers would find more unsettling than imprisonment itself. The journey to those American camps began far from any classroom. German prisoners captured in North Africa, Italy, or Western Europe were first processed through temporary holding facilities. They were searched, identified, and interrogated. Their units, ranks, and specialties were recorded with meticulous precision. Officers were separated almost immediately. Ranks still mattered even in defeat. From European ports, they were transported across the Atlantic in guarded convoys. The crossing itself was a psychological shock. Many officers, raised on years of Nazi propaganda, had been told that American society was decadent, racially divided, intellectually shallow. What they encountered instead were clean ships, disciplined crews, and an industrial efficiency that contradicted everything they had been taught. Upon arrival in the United States, the scale of the operation became impossible to ignore. Train after train carried prisoners inland, away from the coast, deep into the American interior. Barbed wire camps appeared in places many Germans could not pronounce: Texas plains, Midwestern farmland, pine forests of the South. The geography alone was disorienting. There were no ruins, no air raid sirens, no shortages visible from the train windows. Officer camps were deliberately designed to be orderly and controlled. Barracks were functional but not brutal. Food met caloric requirements and often exceeded what civilians in Germany were receiving by 1944. Medical care was consistent. Mail was permitted. International Red Cross inspections were frequent and largely uneventful. This alone created tension. To many German officers, humane treatment felt suspicious. War, as they understood it, was supposed to be punitive. Defeat was meant to degrade. Instead, they were being preserved. Inside the camps, German military hierarchy quickly reasserted itself. Senior officers issued orders. Nazi loyalists formed inner circles. Informal tribunals punished those suspected of anti-Hitler views. Murders occurred in several camps, disguised as accidents or suicides. The wire might have belonged to the Americans, but ideological control was still German. American camp commanders watched carefully. By late 1943, reports from intelligence officers and psychological warfare units made the pattern clear. Idle officers were dangerous. They reinforced Nazi ideology. They intimidated moderates. They turned captivity into a breeding ground for extremism. The solution was not obvious. Forced re-education risked backlash and violation of international law. Heavy-handed propaganda would only confirm German suspicions. Doing nothing was no longer an option. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Within the U.S. Army, a group of officers, academics, and civilian advisors began to argue that the Geneva Convention's allowance for intellectual pursuits could be expanded quietly and legally. Instead of lectures about democracy delivered by uniformed officers, they proposed something more subtle: college-level education. Not slogans, not indoctrination. Structured courses, textbooks, exams, discussions, subjects that required thought rather than obedience. The idea was approved cautiously. The War Department authorized pilot programs under what became known as the Intellectual Diversion Program. Its purpose was carefully worded to occupy prisoners' time, reduce unrest, and encourage critical thinking. Any ideological effect would be indirect and deniable. Civilian professors were recruited. Many came from American universities already supporting the war effort. They were instructed not to argue, not to preach, not to humiliate. They would teach their subjects as they would in any college: classroom, history, economics, engineering, literature, political science. When the first classes were announced inside officer camps, reaction was immediate and conflicted. Some German officers dismissed the program as a trick. Others feared it was a tool for surveillance. Hardline Nazis discouraged attendance, branding it weakness. Yet curiosity proved stronger than ideology. Men who had spent years commanding troops found themselves hungry for structure, for purpose, for something beyond waiting. Attendance grew, and soon, classrooms filled with men who had once believed that American culture was incapable of producing serious thought now sitting in silence, copying notes from a chalkboard. The camps had not changed physically, but something inside them had begun to shift. That shift would soon expose fractures not only among the prisoners, but within the very ideology they had sworn to defend, fractures that would deepen as the program expanded. And with that expansion, the war inside the wire entered a far more complex phase. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. The first angle was human, and it emerged quietly. In the posture of the men sitting at those desks, German officers had been trained to command, not to question. Their education, particularly after 1933, emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and ideological certainty. Even technical subjects were framed through the lens of service to the state. In the camps, that certainty began to erode not through argument, but through exposure. In classrooms run by American civilians, no one demanded loyalty. No one saluted. No one corrected them for speaking freely. Questions were answered directly or deferred honestly when answers were unclear. For officers accustomed to a system that punished doubt, this absence of fear was disorienting. Some reacted defensively. They challenged instructors aggressively, attempting to assert intellectual dominance. Others remained silent, listening carefully, measuring the tone rather than the content. A smaller number leaned forward, engaged, relieved to think without consequence. The second angle was ideological, and it unsettled the prisoners more deeply than the lectures themselves. Nazi propaganda had portrayed American democracy as chaotic and intellectually shallow, a nation driven by money, incapable of discipline or sacrifice. Yet the structure of the classes contradicted that image. The syllabi were rigorous. The instructors were prepared. The discussions were orderly but open. Democracy, as it appeared here, was not loud or weak. It was confident enough to allow disagreement. That confidence was the third angle. The United States did not need these men to believe anything immediately. It did not threaten them with punishment for dissent. Instead, it placed its own institutions, its universities, its educators, its methods of inquiry directly in front of its enemies. Without apology. To many German officers, this was more unsettling than propaganda ever could be. A system that felt no need to shout suggested a system that believed it would endure. The fourth angle was psychological warfare. Though it was never labeled as such inside the camps, education filled time. It broke monotony. It reduced the power of extremist prisoner leaders by giving men an alternative. Authority structure, one based on knowledge rather than rank. Attendance was voluntary, but absence became conspicuous. Officers who refused to participate increasingly found themselves isolated. While those who attended gained social influence, the classroom became neutral ground. And within that space, ideas once considered dangerous could be examined without immediate reprisal. The final angle in this phase was control, not through force, but through environment. By shaping how prisoners spent their days, the Americans quietly shaped how they thought about the future. Courses in agriculture hinted at rebuilding. Engineering suggested usefulness beyond war. Political theory, taught carefully and comparatively, introduced alternatives without prescribing conclusions. The officers were still prisoners, but they were no longer static, and as these programs expanded across camps, the effects began to ripple outward, creating tension not just between Americans and Germans, but among the prisoners themselves. Those internal conflicts would soon force the program into a more dangerous and revealing phase. As education spread through the officer camps, its most immediate consequence was division. Not all German prisoners experienced the classrooms in the same way. Some officers attended lectures openly, eager to engage. Others sat in the back, listening without speaking, careful not to draw attention. A hardened minority refused entirely, viewing the program as a threat, not because of what was being taught, but because of what it weakened inside the camps. Nazi loyalists had long relied on isolation and fear to maintain control. Informal courts, whispered accusations, and nighttime violence had enforced ideological conformity. Education disrupted that system. Men who spent their evenings discussing economics or history were less present in barracks politics. Authority began to shift from rank to intellect. This shift produced friction. In several camps, instructors noticed sudden drops in attendance after outspoken officers were confronted or intimidated. American intelligence units monitoring camp morale recorded spikes in tension following certain lectures, particularly those touching on constitutional systems, civilian-military relations, or Germany's pre-war history. The classes were not overtly political, but the implications were unavoidable. To manage this, the Americans refined the program. Textbooks were screened but not censored beyond security concerns. Instructors were briefed to avoid humiliating comparisons. Courses were framed academically, often beginning with ancient history or neutral technical subjects before moving closer to the modern era. This gradual approach reduced resistance and drew in men who might otherwise have stayed away. The logistical angle revealed the program's seriousness. These were not improvised talks. Libraries were assembled inside the camps. Thousands of books were shipped, many in German, some in English. Examinations were offered. Certificates were issued. In certain camps, full curricula equivalent to American college courses were established. By late 1944, some German officers were attending as many as 20 hours of lectures per week, American instructors reported. Something unexpected: the officers were not intellectually inferior. Many were highly educated, particularly in engineering and science. Their questions were precise. Their critiques were sharp. But their worldview was narrow, shaped by years of ideological filtering. When presented with primary sources, comparative systems, and open discussion, that narrowness became visible to themselves. Another angle emerged in the form of surveillance. The U.S. Army did not abandon caution. Intelligence officers attended classes discreetly. Discussions were observed, not to punish dissent, but to understand shifts in thinking. Reports noted gradual changes in language. Fewer absolutist statements. More conditional phrasing. Less certainty. This was not conversion. It was erosion. Perhaps the most revealing angle came from the officers themselves. Diaries and post-war interviews described the experience as unsettling rather than comforting. Many wrote that captivity in America forced them to confront contradictions they had previously ignored. Not because Americans told them they were wrong, but because Americans did not seem afraid to let them think. By early 1945, the program had expanded to dozens of camps. Thousands of officers were enrolled. The wire remained. Guards still patrolled. The war continued to rage overseas. But inside the classrooms, something irreversible had begun. The prisoners were no longer just waiting to be released. They were preparing consciously or not for a world in which their old certainties might not survive. That realization would collide violently with events unfolding in Europe as the war approached its final decisive phase. By the spring of 1945, the atmosphere inside the American POW camps had changed. News from Europe arrived daily, sometimes through official briefings, sometimes through rumors carried by newly arrived prisoners. Cities once spoken of with pride were now described in ashes. Entire German armies had vanished from maps. The Rhine had been crossed. Berlin was encircled, for the officers sitting in American classrooms. The lectures no longer felt abstract. What had once been an intellectual diversion was now colliding with reality. American instructors noticed the shift immediately. Questions became sharper, more urgent. Discussions that once lingered on theory now turned toward responsibility, collapse, and consequence. Courses on political systems suddenly carried weight. Engineering lectures were framed by thoughts of reconstruction. History, once distant, now felt personal. The prisoners understood something fundamental before it was officially announced. They were losing the war within the camps. Nazi authority weakened rapidly. Men who had enforced ideological discipline found their influence slipping. Loyalty oaths meant little when the state that demanded them was disintegrating. Some hardliners withdrew into silence. Others clung to denial, dismissing reports as enemy lies. But denial was becoming harder to maintain. American intelligence reports from March and April 1945 describe a measurable decline in extremist behavior. Attendance at educational programs peaked. Requests for additional courses increased. Officers who had previously refused to engage now asked for placement, sometimes citing future usefulness, sometimes saying nothing at all. Education had become preparation. The U.S. Army responded by expanding the scope of instruction. Courses on agriculture emphasized food production in devastated economies. Civil administration classes examined municipal governance and civilian oversight. Comparative political studies were handled carefully, often presenting multiple systems without declaring a winner. But the contrast was unavoidable. The decisive moment came not with a lecture, but with confirmation. In late April and early May, news of Adolf Hitler's death reached the camps. Shortly after, Germany's unconditional surrender followed. The Third Reich, which had defined these officers' identities for over a decade, ceased to exist. There was no ceremony inside the camps, no celebration, just silence. Men sat in classrooms long after lectures ended, staring at desks, rereading notes, or saying nothing at all. For many, the defeat was not just military. It was existential. The system they had served, often unquestioningly, was gone. The future was undefined. And the education they had once viewed with suspicion now appeared differently. Not as humiliation, but as a lifeline. American planners had anticipated this moment. Internal memoranda emphasized restraint. No triumphalism. No ideological victory laps. The purpose of the program, they insisted, was not to punish the defeated, but to stabilize the aftermath inside the camps. Officers began to speak openly about mistakes, about fear, about what awaited them at home. The classrooms became spaces of reckoning, not confessionals, but forums where reality could no longer be avoided. The war outside the wire had ended, but the most difficult confrontation for these men was only beginning. It would unfold not on battlefields, but in memory, responsibility, and the uncertain task of returning to a shattered nation. After the surrender, time inside the camp slowed. There were no parades, no speeches. The guards still changed shifts. Meals were still served at the same hours. But the meaning of captivity had changed completely. These men were no longer prisoners of a fighting enemy. They were prisoners of the aftermath. For German officers, this distinction mattered. Repatriation was not immediate. The United States, like the other Allied powers, faced the problem of what came next. Germany was in ruins. Infrastructure had collapsed. Civil administration barely existed in many regions. Millions were displaced. Returning trained officers without preparation risked instability in a nation already on the brink. Education, which had once been optional, now became central. Courses shifted in tone. Without mentioning policy, instructors focused increasingly on practical reconstruction. Engineering lectures examined bridge repair and water systems. Agricultural classes discussed soil recovery after overuse and bombardment. Economics addressed scarcity, rationing, and currency collapse. These were not abstract problems. They were descriptions of what awaited the men beyond the wire. For many officers, The realization was brutal. They would not be returning to positions of command. The army they had served was dissolved. Ranks meant nothing in a civilian landscape dominated by hunger and debris. The skills that had once defined them, maneuver, firepower, discipline, were suddenly irrelevant. What remained was knowledge. American reports from late 1945 indicate that prisoners increasingly requested certificates, transcripts, and documentation of their coursework. They understood that paper, not medals, would determine their future usefulness. Some learned English seriously for the first time. Others focused on technical subjects, preparing to work in industries that no longer existed, but would have to be rebuilt. The emotional shift was visible. Instructors described a quiet intensity in the classrooms. Less debate. More listening. Less challenge. More absorption. The confidence of command had been replaced by the humility of necessity. This period also exposed the final collapse of Nazi ideology within the camps, without a state to enforce it. Without victories to justify it, the belief system hollowed out. A small number of prisoners remained defiant, but they were increasingly isolated. The majority no longer found meaning in slogans. Reality had overtaken rhetoric. American officials documented these changes carefully, not as proof of success, but as indicators of stability. The goal was no longer to manage enemy prisoners. It was to shape the conditions under which former enemies would return home. By late 1945 and into 1946, repatriation began in stages. Officers boarded ships not as representatives of a regime, but as individuals facing uncertain futures. Many carried books acquired in the camps. Some carried notes from lectures. A few carried certificates bearing the seals of American institutions. None of them returned unchanged. They left behind the wire, the towers, the classrooms, but they carried with them the quiet disruption of an experience that contradicted everything they had expected from defeat. And as they stepped back onto European soil, into cities flattened by war, the true consequences of that education would begin to reveal themselves slowly, unevenly, and far from any classroom. When German officers returned home, they did not return to a nation at peace. They returned to ruins. Cities that had once symbolized industrial strength lay flattened. Rail lines were twisted. Bridges were gone. Water systems barely functioned. In many towns, civilian administration existed only on paper. Hunger was immediate. Displacement was everywhere. Authority was fragmented among occupying powers, local councils, and remnants of pre-war bureaucracy. For former officers, the transition was abrupt and disorienting. Uniforms had no meaning. Rank offered no protection. Many were viewed with suspicion, not admiration. Some concealed their military past entirely. Others were interrogated, screened, or temporarily restricted under Allied denazification policies. The world they had known had vanished, replaced by a reality that demanded rebuilding rather than command. It was here, far from the American camps, that the long-term effects of the education programs began to surface. Former prisoners reported for work in municipalities, engineering firms, agricultural collectives, and reconstruction offices. A number of them carried documentation from their time in captivity, certificates of coursework, letters from instructors, proof of technical training completed while behind wire. These papers were not guarantees of employment, but they mattered in a society desperate for expertise. Allied occupation authorities took note. American and British reports from the late 1940s observed that former posts who had participated in educational programs adjusted more quickly to civilian roles. They demonstrated familiarity with administrative processes, technical planning, and collaborative problem-solving. They were not transformed into Democrats overnight, but they were less rigid, less isolated, more adaptable. In some cases, the influence was direct. Officers trained in engineering during captivity contributed to rebuilding transport networks. Those who studied agriculture advised on soil recovery and food production. Others, exposed to comparative political systems, participated cautiously in emerging local councils. understanding, at least intellectually, the separation between military authority and civilian governance. This was not universal. Many struggled. Trauma, guilt, and resentment did not disappear with education. But the contrast between those who had been intellectually engaged in captivity and those who had not was visible. The program's impact extended beyond individuals. In post-war analyses, American planners described the education initiative as a stabilizing factor. It reduced radicalization. It softened the return of large numbers of trained men into a fragile society. It did not erase responsibility for the war, but it lowered the risk of immediate ideological resurgence. German perspectives, recorded in memoirs and interviews decades later, often emphasized shock rather than gratitude. Many former officers admitted that the experience forced them to confront contradictions they had avoided. They had been defeated militarily but challenged intellectually by a system that did not need to humiliate them. That realization lingered. The classrooms behind barbed wire had not rebuilt Germany, but they had quietly influenced the people who would, and as the occupation years stretched on, those influences would intersect with larger political shifts that would define not only Germany's recovery, but the emerging global order. When German officers returned home, they did not return to a nation at peace. They returned to ruins. Cities that had once symbolized industrial strength lay flattened. Rail lines were twisted, bridges were gone. Water systems barely functioned. In many towns, civilian administration existed only on paper. Hunger was immediate. Displacement was everywhere. Authority was fragmented among occupying powers, local councils, and remnants of pre-war bureaucracy. For former officers, the transition was abrupt and disorienting. Uniforms had no meaning, rank offered no protection. Many were viewed with suspicion, not admiration. Some concealed their military past entirely. Others were interrogated, screened, or temporarily restricted under Allied denazification policies. The world they had known had vanished, replaced by a reality that demanded rebuilding rather than command. It was here, far from the American camps, that the long-term effects of the education programs began to surface. Former prisoners reported. For work in municipalities, engineering firms, agricultural collectives, and reconstruction offices, a number of them carried documentation from their time in captivity, certificates of coursework, letters from instructors, proof of technical training completed while behind wire. These papers were not guarantees of employment, but they mattered in a society desperate for expertise. Allied occupation authorities took note. American and British reports from the late 1940s observed that former posts who had participated in educational programs adjusted more quickly to civilian roles. They demonstrated familiarity with administrative processes, technical planning, and collaborative problem-solving. They were not transformed into Democrats overnight, but they were less rigid, less isolated, more adaptable. In some cases, the influence was direct. Officers trained in engineering during captivity contributed to rebuilding transport networks. Those who studied agriculture advised on soil recovery and food production. Others, exposed to comparative political systems, participated cautiously in emerging local councils, understanding, at least intellectually, the separation between military authority and civilian governance. This was not universal. Many struggled. Trauma, guilt, and resentment did not disappear with education. But the contrast between those who had been intellectually engaged in captivity and those who had not was visible. The program's impact extended beyond individuals. In post-war analyses, American planners described the education initiative as a stabilizing factor. It reduced radicalization. It softened the return of large numbers of trained men into a fragile society. It did not erase responsibility for the war, but it lowered the risk of immediate ideological resurgence. German perspectives, recorded in memoirs and interviews decades later, often emphasized shock rather than gratitude. Many former officers admitted that the experience forced them to confront contradictions they had avoided. They had been defeated militarily but challenged intellectually by a system that did not need to humiliate them. That realization lingered. The classrooms behind barbed wire had not rebuilt Germany, but they had quietly influenced the people who would, and as the occupation years stretched on, those influences would intersect with larger political shifts that would define not only Germany's recovery, but the emerging global order. In the quiet of an empty barracks, long after the last prisoner had departed, the chalkboards stood blank, the notebooks stacked and forgotten. Yet the silence carried the weight of what had happened inside those walls. Education had become a weapon, subtle, nonviolent, yet profoundly transformative. It did not humiliate. It did not coerce. It forced confrontation with reality, with ideology, and most importantly, with one's own assumptions. For the German officers, this experience was unsettling in a way no battlefield ever could be. They had been trained to command, to obey, to dominate. And here, in captivity, they were exposed to authority that required nothing of them except attention and thought. It revealed a society confident enough to allow intellectual freedom, a military confident enough to guard without intimidation, and a nation confident enough to shape the future without the use of force. History often measures victory in territory taken, cities captured or enemies destroyed. The American classrooms suggest another metric, the endurance of ideas. By allowing study, reflection, and engagement, the United States exercised power in its most patient form. Minds, once rigid with obedience and ideology, were given space to bend, to question, and eventually to adapt. The implications stretched far beyond the camps. Reconstructed Germany, stabilized and cautiously democratic, carried the faint imprint of these lessons. The officers who returned home brought with them knowledge and perspective that would shape Reconstruction, civil administration, and indirectly the emerging Cold War order. The war was over, but the battle for understanding, for adaptability, and for restraint had only begun. In the end, the story is not one of simple kindness, nor of naive optimism. It is a story of confidence, strategy, and foresight, a reminder that sometimes the most profound victories occur not on the battlefield, but in the quiet spaces of thought and reflection, where even an enemy can be taught to see a world differently.